energy and air pollution will be one of the top 5 issues for the general election.
We talk about Putin being in control. He's not really. It's the various factions under him, and it suits them to have him at the front.
If you're trying to save for a house deposit and you'd have to save up some crazy amount of money, how on earth are you going to do that if a pint is £7?
There's certain key things that we want from India and there's certain key things that they want from us.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. Coming up on today's programme, we'll hear from a leading expert on the concrete that has created a crisis for British schools, hospitals and potentially a lot of other buildings. Plus, the former Bank of England policymaker Michael Saunders will be joining us to discuss growth and the government's finances.
But first, I imagine most of you have heard this by now.
Does anyone ever say, you know what, you've done a good job because everyone else has sat on their and done nothing? No signs of that? No?
I often feel like that, Caroline. But that was the Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, caught off guard wearing a microphone after an interview with ITV. She did later apologise for the language, it has to be said.
And then we think of all of the political gaffes that there have been. I mean, there's no shortage of them. Brown's gaffe, calling a voter, a former Labour Party voter, a bigoted person was one. You know, David Cameron had a major gaffe too. Lots of them spring to mind. The problem is it's such a serious issue. We're talking about concrete, potentially collapsing in schools. A lot of people did not take this sort of blame game well.
No, I mean, you're a parent, Caroline, so I feel like you're much closer to the issue here, and you've done a good interview on it as well.
Listen, I feel white hot annoyance
I'm
around
away
this.
from you. I can feel the anger.
But we are days away from schools opening when this announcement came out. So yes, I think I suspect I reflect the feelings of many parents who are worried.
Well, look, one of the reasons that Gillian Keegan is under so much pressure is Bloomberg's report that the Education Secretary was on holiday in Spain when the problem unfolded. It was Alex Wickham's scoop, and he joins us now. Alex, what do you think was revealed when the mask slipped?
Yeah, well, it just has been a shambolic episode again for the government. Rishi Sunak came into this September, the end of the parliamentary recess over summer, hoping to reset his government. He did a little reshuffle at the end of last week. It was pretty underwhelming. He's shuffled his pack inside Downing Street behind closed doors with a few new advisors, getting rid of some as well. But the reality is, it's just been completely overshadowed by this schools disaster, really, that government just can't seem to get a grip of. And I think the danger for Sunak and the Education Secretary is they really are starting to look like they don't have control of the situation. And, day by day, something else comes out, whether it's Gillian Keegan's hot mic moment or, emerging that Rishi Sunak was the one when he was Chancellor who blocked the money for rebuilding more schools. And it just feels like, the government's in a bit of chaos already as we go back to school.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a couple of different ways of taking Keegan's comments. It could either be blaming former Conservative governments or even going back as far as the Labour government, which left office in 2010, or she could be talking about industry. I mean, we don't really know. It's sort of blaming anyone else effectively. I mean, it is hard to imagine a worse sort of big reset for government. Parliament returning on Monday, schools going back sort of Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
Yeah, and I think we have to assume it is fair to assume that who Gillian Keegan was talking about when she said that she was the one sorting it out and everybody else had been on their backsides was other governments, Tory governments, and Tory ministers in other departments. So she is talking about, as one advisor put it to me yesterday, a multi-government, cross-government failure. So, several government departments, from the Department for Education to the Treasury to Downing Street, plus over the course of several different administrations, from Rishi Sunak's current administration to Boris Johnson's administration before, and potentially through all the way to David Cameron and austerity at the beginning. That's what Gillian Keegan was saying. they're all to blame, basically, is what she was saying. And it is a frankly astonishing admission. I mean, we can all see it's true, but it's an astonishing thing for a Tory minister to be caught saying, because imagine if you're a Labour strategist a year away from an election, they've written your, attack adverts for you there. The Tories essentially admitting themselves that they're the ones who haven't got on top of this looming crisis that's been known about for years, and now everyone's in an absolute mess over it.
All right, Alex, you have been a chronicler of British politics for a long time now. I'm going to have to ask you, what's your favourite hot mic mome?
There's been so many. I have to say, I think my favourite is a slightly different one. It's David Cameron. I think it was the day after the Brexit referendum, and he sort of comes outside Downing Street and he stands in front of the lectern and he gives the news to the nation that he's lost and he's going to be standing down as Prime Minister. A huge seismic moment in British politics. Finishes the statement, turns around, walks back to the black door of number 10, microphone still on, and Cameron just goes, do. Right. Which just sums up to me the sort of, we tried that referendum, it didn't work, I'm finished. Oh, well, whatever. And it's sort of, it was just a amazing moment.
It was an absolutely staggering moment. I remember watching it. It was very early in the morning when he did that, because the referendum came as such a shock to the nation, and that swift resignation. I remember watching it about 7 in the morning. Totally flabbergasting. Thank you so much, Alex Wickham, for being with us then, including the scoop, yes, that the Education Secretary was on holiday in Spain. I mean, partly that was to do with, again, another issue, airport delays. That's partly why she was still on holiday, as this whole issue around closing schools actually came to the fore. So our thanks to Bloomberg's Alex Wickham. So beyond the froth then of the gaffe and the blame game, the issue of crumbling concrete in schools, in hospitals and potentially many other buildings remains. Chris Goodier is the director of Loughborough's Centre for Innovation and Collaborative Construction Engineering. He was actually one of the academics who contributed to the report which led to the schools being closed in the first place. We asked him how much we actually know about this defective concrete.
It's gone relatively under the radar until a couple of years ago. NHS had been on it for a couple of years and they funded the research at Loughborough University, and that have very much now managed the problem. So the problem we have as a country is that, first of all, we need to find out where all the wreck is, and it's in, and we don't have a national register. So now DfE are obviously running around finding it. NHS know where it is. But we have all the other government departments now trying to find it, and the private sector are trying to find it as well. And then it needs to be assessed by a qualified surveyor or engineer who knows what they're looking for. And then once all that has been done, and we're talking, we have, I'm guessing, more than 1 million buildings in the country. Tens of thousands will have racking, and all that needs to be looked at. So this is not going to be done in a few weeks. We're going to be living with rack for a few years. Most of the rack we find will be okay and structurally sound and will last more years, 10, 20, 30 years more. But a proportion of it will need to be strengthened, and there's various means of doing that. And a small proportion will need to be condemned and taken off and the roof replaced.
So this could be a significantly larger problem. I mean, to me, it's sounding like a crisis on the scale of asbestos and having to deal with that building material. Can you answer this perhaps for me? Why are schools being closed now over the issue? As you say, this issue has been in the background. It's been known, but it has suddenly come to the fore of public consciousness because the government is closing schools in the week that schools reopen after the summer holidays. And in the light of the pandemic, a lot of people are very concerned about this.
I totally understand the anxiety of parents. Why now? Surely we should have known this. So my understanding is that the DfE have been taking advice from the leading structural engineers of the country, taking advice from us here at Loughborough University on understanding the rack issue. They 2 years ago, they contacted all the schools to ask them to look at their schools and to find out if they got RAC. That's been a slow process, partly because there's so many schools and the schools are experts on this, and so some of them have been hard to reach. But I also believe that over the last few weeks, some new evidence has come to light that has changed DfE's perception of the risk of RAC. As in, they've been rapidly inspecting lots of schools over the summer, and they have found some schools that they think are particularly at risk, that, as I said, has changed their opinion and approach of the risk of RAC. And that's why what seemed was a last-minute decision, because their perception of the risk of the RAC to the schools has changed very quickly.
Yes, investigations into this particular type of lightweight concrete were stepped up in 2018 because the roof of a primary school in Kent collapsed without warning. So that was one of the reasons, actually, that all of these investigations really were kick-started. Do you think that there's been another incident over the summer? Is there something specific that we know about, or is it simply the inspections?
I think something has happened. It's not been released publicly. And certainly there's been no loss of life, because that would be, out in the media. And I don't think, and as are collapses of schools make the media and get out there whether the DfE want it to or not, because it's very visible. So I don't think there's been any major collapse, or definitely no loss of life. But as I said, as they've been inspecting schools, I think they have found some that maybe are more defective than they first thought, and has changed their opinion of the risk and what to do. So they've gone for the very much safety risk approach that they know would cause a media and a societal crisis, but they have gone for safety first. Until they've inspected those schools and have the high confidence that they're safe, they're not going to let pupils back in.
That was Chris Goodier, the director of Loughborough's Centre on Innovation and Collaborative Construction Engineering, just talking us through RAC, the reinforced aerated concrete issue then for schools and UK buildings.
So that's the funding crisis du jour, repairing schools. But of course, we wouldn't be having that conversation if the country's finances weren't extremely stretched. And joining us now is former Bank of England policymaker Michael Saunders, who is also now a senior economic advisor at Oxford Economics. He's been writing about the fiscal rules lately. Welcome to you, Michael. Great to have you back on.
Nice to be back.
On Friday, the Office for National Statistics revised up the growth picture for the UK. It doesn't look as bad as it was coming out of the pandemic anymore. Does this change the miserable narrative in your view? Have we been unfairly talking down the UK?
No, it doesn't change the broad picture. The UK has had low potential growth since 2010, really. And the ONS revisions don't change that picture. Potential growth since 2010 has been much lower than it was in the preceding 20 years. And that's been translated into persistent low growth in living standards, little or no growth in real wages for 15 years now. And the outlook, I think, at the moment, I'm afraid, is for more of the same.
That's utterly grim. We're a year on from Liz Truss becoming Prime Minister. You had said previously that the one thing she got right was identifying this issue of Britain's growth problem. What do you think now, as we start a new parliamentary session and we get closer to the next general election, 15 months out, what can government and the Bank of England do to improve things for people in Britain?
Well, to come back to Liz Truss, she was right to identify the issue of low potential growth. I always think she was completely wrong, totally wrong, in how she sought to address it with unfunded tax cuts that leave the fiscal position on a worsening path. Look, there's a well-known agenda of policy measures recommended by the IMF and the OECD over recent years. Increased public investment, better education, more education spending, closer trade links to Europe, better childcare. The government really hasn't been doing enough on that agenda not just in the last year or two, but over the last decade. And I think that the issue over the school buildings, which you talked about in your previous section, highlights the broader picture, the broader issue of persistently low public investment in the UK. Public investment in the UK has long been among the lowest across the advanced economies, well below the average. And we know that the returns from public investment in terms of the boost to potential growth are relatively high, let alone the issues of child safety, which have come up with the school buildings crisis. And by opting for low public investment, the UK has helped to create this environment of low potential growth. And so I think one of the challenges for the next few years is to ensure that we can have both a sustainable fiscal position and sustained higher levels of public investment. And in order to achieve that, we probably need to reform the fiscal rules.
So what's wrong with the fiscal rules as they stand?
Well, look, the aim of the fiscal rules, their whole purpose is to try to ensure fiscal sustainability and to achieve it in a way that doesn't damage the economy and actually helps to make the economy better over time. The current fiscal rules fail to achieve that basic aim of ensuring fiscal sustainability. At the moment, the UK has two major fiscal rules. One is that the ratio of public debt to GDP should be falling in the OBR's forecast 5 years ahead. And the second is that the fiscal deficit, the overall borrowing requirement of the government, should be below 3% of GDP, also 5 years ahead. As you'll see, that the weakness, one big weakness of those rules, is that they can be met if the government says that it intends to tighten fiscal policy at some point in the future, 4 or 5 years ahead, such that the OBR will then project that debt will fall and the deficit will be below 3% of GDP 5 years ahead. But the government never needs to actually fulfill that aim of fiscal tightening, and as the horizon rolls forward, it can just simply push forward that fiscal tightening by a further year, and in the meantime the deficit stays high and debts continue to rise. And that's been a pattern that we've seen since 2010. The government has had repeated targets to aim to reduce public borrowing. They've always been met in the forecast. They've never been met in the data. Because as the distant years, the years 4 and year 5, become near term, the government has tended to loosen up on fiscal policy while still indicating that it will tighten fiscal policy at some point out in the future. So that's the first problem, that they don't achieve the basic aim of ensuring fiscal sustainability. But the other key problem is that they disincentivize governments from maintaining or expanding public investment, because they make no distinction between debt and deficits that are caused by public investment, which will yield long-term gains for the economy and for future generations, and debt and deficits that are just caused by current spending. And so governments have always found it easier to try to achieve a forecast of a lower deficit and falling debt by cutting public investment.
Austerity. In other words,
but it's been austerity focused on public investment in particular, despite the adverse long-term effects of that. So what you need is fiscal rules which, first of all, ensure that you're on a sustainable fiscal path, but second, which encourage governments to maintain or expand public investment.
Yeah. So the government's targets basically for debt and for borrowing can be dodged, and they also don't deliver in terms of economic growth over the long term. My question then to you is, now looking at the statements that we've had from the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has made very positive noises in this area. Do you see any real change being offered by Labour, and what changes would you want, to be made to these fiscal rules, which are used with voters as evidence of, economic prowess?
So it's not yet clear exactly what Labour would do. They've talked, I think in quite sensible language, of the aim of keeping debt under control and wanting to expand public investment. But we'll have to wait and see exactly how they would reform the fiscal rules. My proposals would be that the government should aim to improve public sector net worth, that is assets, less liabilities, over a 5 to 10 year view, aim to get public debt falling 3 years ahead, not 5 years ahead, so it can't be dodged so easily, and to aim for a balance or surplus on the current budget, that is public borrowing excluding investment. Now that would allow public investment to rise. You could have public investment considerably higher than it has been over recent years, within a framework in which the government is obliged, because of the shorter time horizon, to ensure that the overall current budget is kept under control and public debts don't continue to trend higher. I don't know as to whether that's what Labour will do, but I think those kinds of changes would put the UK in a better place than the fiscal rules that we have at the moment.
Michael, would you agree with the former boss of the Office for Budget Responsibility that the OBR should be given more resources so that they can also cost Labour's fiscal plans, given polls suggest they are going to be the next government?
Yes, I think that would be sensible. I also think that the OBR probably should extend their forecast horizon out a bit in order to provide a better platform to assess the long-term effects of the policies of whichever party is in power. At the moment, the OBR produce detailed forecasts for the economy 5 years ahead. That's the horizon in which the fiscal rules have to be met. But some policy measures, many policy measures, have their full effects on potential growth longer than 5 years ahead. If you think of, say, the childcare measures, which the Chancellor sketched out, no more than that, in the budget early this year, they're not going to be introduced for 2 to 3 years. They're not funded yet. But if they are going to have an effect, it will probably be largely beyond the 5-year forecast horizon from the OBR. Same with a lot of public investment. So having a forecast horizon that's longer than 5 years, I would suggest 10 years, would allow the OBR to better recognise the potential gains from longer-term supply-side measures, which may yield their full benefits beyond the 5-year current horizon.
A question then about experts. There was a long period after the Brexit vote in which experts were basically disregarded, and that was also implemented, for the Office for Budget Responsibility, and that's only a year ago under Liz Truss that they were sidelined. Are you back in favour?
Well, I don't think this is about me.
Sure.
But many of your colleagues former colleagues are now advising the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt on his Economic Advisory Council. Is that a step in the right direction?
Well, I don't know what advice they're giving and whether that advice is taken. But the UK, over the last 10, 12 years, has made economic policy errors, which many of the experts identified at the time as being errors. A lot of people can be clever with hindsight. The people you listen to most are those who can tell you at the time when things are wrong, because they've got deep knowledge, well-founded expertise. And one of those errors was to have very low public investment during the 2010s, at a time when the economy had plenty of spare capacity and borrowing costs were low. Another one also was to downplay the economic costs of Brexit, which many experts warned would be substantial. I think the evidence that we've seen since Brexit is consistent with that. So maybe the experts know something after all, and we should try to learn the lessons from expert advice rather than dismiss it.
That was Michael Saunders, the former Bank of England policymaker who's now senior economic advisor at Oxford Economics. Lizzy, the only thing I can say is that is a former policymaker unleashed, untamed really by an official role. he was talking about announcement heavy from the government, mistake strewn and delivery light. I can't see that as anything other than a really damning view on the Conservative government and on the fact that we're reaping the whirlwind of low investment in Britain.
Yeah, what an indictment. However, although he said that nice sounds are coming out of Labour, no specifics. And we are in the back to school period. We're meant to be in a reset period. As you said, we've got our eyes on the next election. What everyone wants, including the experts, is specificity.
Yes, and I think that the change to the fiscal rules, i.e. the targets that the government presents to all of us, talking about debt, borrowing and investment, that those really need to be tightened up. I think this is a big new argument, a lot of new thinking, I think, as a result of the last few years.
Yeah, let us not think that this is the weeds. These are the masks, the smoke and mirrors that the government provides to make things seem responsible fiscally. And likewise, Labour wanting to change the fiscal rules. So very important indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Woolcock and our audio engineer was Mariful Hussain. I'm Lizzy Burden.
And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with Prime Minister's Questions tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you very much. Right.